Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin, the war of words between the FAA and SpaceX continues. And that is what is remaining, by the way. Just words. As near as we can tell, no legal action has been undertaken by SpaceX against the FAA in spite of extremely serious allegations that they've been making against the agency. Allegations that the administrator of the FAA, Administrator Whitaker, that is, lied or provided false information to the Congress during his recent testimony. In fact, SpaceX's most recent statement said the following: FAA Administrator Whitaker made several incorrect statements today regarding SpaceX. In fact, every statement he made was incorrect. So why just the open letters to Congress? Why not take more serious action in court? And what was the FAA exactly lying about? Well, in just a moment, you're going to find out some information about this case that neither the FAA or SpaceX really want you to hear. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon and welcome to our latest Angry Bulletin regarding the ongoing FAA SpaceX drama, something that I was tired of quite some time ago, and that really hasn't changed. But at the same time, it's very newsworthy because in the long run, this ongoing war of words could have a very significant impact on the future of spaceflight. So before we get to the actual accusations here, we also need to look at what SpaceX is actually doing. This recent open letter that was sent to the Congress was actually sent to Representative Kevin Kiley from California. And even though many of you might think that every politician from California is a tree-hugging socialist, this region of California has actually voted very reliably Republican for quite some time, and Mr. Kiley is a fairly partisan politician. He opposed vaccine requirements, also opposed teachers' unions, saying that they're too powerful, and finally, he actually spearheaded an effort to try to recall the governor of California, Democrat of course, and even authored a book entitled Recall Gavin Newsom, The Case Against America's Most Corrupt Governor. So this is the type of politician who's likely to be receptive to anything that's going to be critical of an agency and an agency administrator who was appointed by the Biden administration. So a pretty political maneuver on the part of SpaceX to try to get the support of people who generally will support any allegations being made against Biden and his administration. Not necessarily saying that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that this makes a great deal of sense if you're trying to get somebody who's politically sympathetic to your case. So let's go ahead and move on with the actual letter. Dear Congressman Kiley, SpaceX writes to thank you for taking the opportunity to seek answers from Federal Aviation Administrator Mike Whitaker on FAA's licensing challenges relating to commercial space launch and re-entry during his appearance before Congress today on unrelated matters. In responding to your questions, Administrator Whitaker made several incorrect statements today regarding SpaceX. In fact, every statement he made was incorrect. These are very serious allegations. They either indicate that Administrator Whitaker is incompetent or that he was lying to Congress, which is a very serious crime. First, SpaceX was fully licensed to conduct these Falcon launches, and FAA has not alleged otherwise. With respect to Starship, neither of the two items he referenced, including the sonic boom, are related to public safety, but to environmental considerations that had previously evaluated as posing no risk to the environment. Additionally, his assertion that SpaceX violated state law is simply wrong. SpaceX did not violate state law. SpaceX had a permit for deluge operations from Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ. It is deeply concerning that the administrator does not appear to have accurate information immediately available to him with respect to SpaceX licensing matters. SpaceX has issued a letter on each of these matters previously, and I've covered those in previous episodes. So what are they referring referring to here? Well, during his testimony in front of Congress, Whitaker claimed that SpaceX had launched those 2 Falcon 9 launches that they've been fined for, quote, without a permit, unquote. And technically, this is incorrect. The FAA had issued licenses for both the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launches that took place back in 2023. However, those licenses had very specific conditions spelled out in them in regards to what sort of procedures had to be observed, what sort of tank farms had to be used, and according to the FAA, and once again, we have no written documentation to prove this, they had informed SpaceX that the conditions laid out in the launch licenses had not been fulfilled. Specifically, that SpaceX was making use of a launch control room that had not yet been approved by the FAA, and also they were making use of a new propellant tank farm that the FAA had not yet approved. So if SpaceX launched utilizing that new control room or that new tank farm that the FAA allegedly told SpaceX had not been approved, then they weren't technically licensed for the launch. They were in violation of their license. However, that doesn't mean that they were launching completely without a license. It just indicates that there were problems with their procedures that would lead to fines of some kind. And again, as I've spelled out many times, these fines are tiny slaps on the wrist and really not very significant if SpaceX was indeed launching in violation of FAA requirements, essentially ignoring what the FAA had told them and launching anyway, utilizing facilities that the FAA had not approved. Pretty small fines indeed. On the other side of the equation, though, if the FAA did not properly inform SpaceX that they were in violation, if they did not give them proper notification, then yeah, SpaceX was completely authorized to launch and had no obligations to seek any further confirmation with the FAA whatsoever. It was the FAA's responsibility to tell SpaceX that the facilities that they had specified in these launch license applications were not approved, and they had to remove those procedures from the launch license applications if they wanted to move forward. If the FAA failed to do that, then they are very much in the wrong. And by the way, I have requested copies of these documents from the FAA from my contacts there, and I have yet to receive a response at this time. I will keep you up to date if things change on that. So before we go any further, we also should look at this administrator himself, Mr. Whitaker. Who is this guy? I mean, is he a controversial administrator? Somebody who was opposed in his appointment and it was a partisan kind of appointment? Well, in a country where partisan politics is king, the Senate voted 98-0 to approve Whitaker's appointment to the FAA back in 2022. Although admittedly, this guy was taking over a very troubled agency. For 19 months, the FAA had no administrator whatsoever, and Biden's first choice for the position was actually an extremely controversial one and had to be withdrawn because of lots of problems. I'm not going to go any further into the politics of that, just to say that Whitaker was approved 98-0, and on top of that, had the support of many prominent people in the aviation industry. Shortly after his appointment, the National Business Aviation Association had this to say, quote, "Mike Whitaker has long been an outspoken aviation safety advocate and champion of innovation in the industry who demonstrated during his time as deputy administrator at the FAA that he is a proven leader who delivers results." This was according to NBAA President and CEO Ed Bolin. "We enthusiastically support his confirmation as FAA administrator." And American Airlines issued this statement, quote, "It is essential that the FAA be led by a permanent administrator who understands the intricacies of the system. A former FAA deputy administrator who has spent decades in the aviation industry, Mr. Whitaker is eminently qualified for the role." So, sounds like he was very qualified from the aviation side of things. doesn't appear that he has a great deal of experience if we're talking about spaceflight, which is incredibly important, obviously, to the FAA's new responsibilities of issuing loads of launch licenses for sometimes experimental spacecraft and maintaining public safety at the same time. And there's also other responsibilities, especially environmental ones. But let's go ahead and continue with SpaceX's letter. SpaceX rejects any allegations from the FAA that SpaceX violated any laws. SpaceX is the safest, most reliable launch provider in the world and is absolutely committed to safety in all operations. So, quick facts. Administrator Whitaker alleged that SpaceX launched without a permit. That is false. SpaceX was fully licensed to launch the Falcon missions for which FAA has incorrectly alleged non-compliances. FAA has not alleged SpaceX was not permitted or not licensed to launch these missions. SpaceX receives FAA licensing for all missions subject to the Commercial Space Launch Act. We've already covered why this statement could be problematic depending on what sort of communications the FAA actually made before SpaceX lifted off. Also, in quick fact number 2, Administrator Whitaker alleged that SpaceX moved a fuel farm closer to the population and that SpaceX did not perform a risk analysis. SpaceX moved the fuel farm to a location that is more than twice the distance from the nearest publicly accessible area and provided the FAA with all required analysis, and B, prior to the launch, federal range safety authorities approved the new location of the fuel farm and FAA was on console and did not stop the countdown. I continue to be so incredibly frustrated with this claim that just because an FAA representative was on console and didn't stop the countdown doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong. All it means is that maybe that FAA employee didn't know about the fuel farm violation or any communications that had occurred between the FAA and SpaceX. And also, SpaceX admits in a previous letter that the FAA actually did try to interrupt the countdown. But after consultation between the FAA and SpaceX, it was decided that trying to stop the countdown and interrupt all of the fueling procedures and everything else that goes into a launch would actually be more dangerous than proceeding with the launch as is, which is what they ended up doing. Again, doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong, just means that the FAA decided that it wasn't dangerous enough to completely stop the whole countdown, but they would certainly issue fines afterwards regardless. So, bit misleading there, I have to say, and we're not through. Also, C, the FAA took months to review and approve the revised location and ultimately required no changes to the previously approved federal range configuration. Yeah, that's a significant problem, the amount of time that the FAA invested in finally approving the location of the fuel farm, but again, that doesn't mean that SpaceX can do whatever the hell they want to. Just because the FAA is inefficient doesn't mean that you get to ignore their instructions when it comes to a launch. Then we go to Article 3. Administrator Whitaker stated that SpaceX failed to provide an updated sonic boom analysis and that it was a safety-related incident and that the FAA had to enter into a 2-month consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. And this has nothing to do with safety, again, according to SpaceX. The FWS already reviewed Starship's sonic booms and determined them to have no environmental impact for booms under 1 PSF, that's pound per square foot. SpaceX recently provided FAA data showing a slightly larger sonic boom area. Despite the slightly larger area, there is no new environmental impact. Nevertheless, FAA entered a new environmental consultation with FWS, which could result in a 2-month delay. This is a paperwork exercise that could be swiftly addressed between agencies as a minor paperwork update. Okay, is this actually true? Let's go ahead and consult the original PEA and the sonic boom concerns that were laid out at that time. What are the overpressure levels that were predicted for a super heavy landing when the PEA was put together? Quote, predicted overpressure levels for a super heavy landing range from 2.5 to 15 PSF. Not 1 PSF, 2.5 to 15 PSF. I'm reading straight off the PEA. A very small area of Boca Chica State Park to the south of the VLA is predicted to experience up to 15 PSF during landings at the VLA. A small portion of Brazos Island State Park and portions of Boca Chica State Park are predicted to experience levels of 11 to 15 PSF during landings at the VLA. Public access to Boca Chica State Park, portions of the Lower Rio Grande National Wildlife Refuge, and Brazos Island State Park would be restricted during launch and landing operations. For very good reasons, that's a very high pound per square foot overpressure level. Certainly dangerous, but of course, there's no people in this particular region. But also, Boca Chica Village is predicted to experience 9 PSF during landings at the VLA. Again, this is not a safety consideration from the FAA because the only people at Boca Chica Village, at least during a launch, are going to be SpaceX personnel. And SpaceX personnel is not considered to be part of the public as far as the FAA is concerned during experimental spaceflight operations, or really any kind of spaceflight operations right now. 20 years ago, Congress passed a measure whereby the FAA would be given no jurisdiction whatsoever over any employees of a spaceflight organization or anybody flying on an experimental spacecraft. The FAA has absolutely no jurisdiction over people who are put at risk under those circumstances as long as they have signed some sort of document that guarantees informed consent. However, the southern portion of South Padre Island, in other words, where all the spectators are and where there's a lot of hotels, that sort of thing, that's predicted to experience 6 PSF, and Port Isabel and Laguna Heights are expected to experience 4 to 6 PSF during landings at the VLA. The remainder of South Padre Island is expected to experience between 2 to 4 PSF, and Laguna Vista and Tamaulipas or something like that, Mexico, is expected to experience 2 PSF during landings at the VLA. Now, this is very important. As little as 2 PSF is all that's required to cause damage to windows, and 6 PSF could potentially cause a window to shatter, and 15 PSF will almost certainly cause at least some inconvenience for wildlife in the state parks that are going to be impacted by this. And if the sonic boom map or projected area affected by the sonic boom has changed, then that means it is a public safety issue. It has to be. I can't see how it couldn't be. And also, if the affected areas inside these state parks are going to experience a greater impact in pounds per square foot from the sonic boom, that's something that the Fish and Wildlife Service needs to be informed about, and that's why there needs to be a consultation on the matter. It sucks, and again, it's one of the consequences of lifting off so damn close to all of these protected areas. I've said this many times. I think that this is going to continue to be a huge thorn in SpaceX's side unless Elon Musk ends up having a cabinet position with the president and can pretty much operate with impunity. And in that case, yeah, he'll probably be able to do whatever the hell he wants to for 4 years. And then after that, well, paybacks are hell in politics. I really don't know exactly what sort of long-term advantage is going to be gained if Elon receives that kind of power. But let's go ahead and conclude the letter. Administrator Whitaker alleged that SpaceX did not have a permit for its deluge system and that this delayed FAA licensing. At no time did SpaceX operate its deluge without a permit. Article A, SpaceX was operating under a permit from the TCEQ 2 TCEQ staff were physically present during operation of the deluge. FAA and FWS have evaluated use of the deluge and determined no environmental risk. And then B, at EPA's request, SpaceX is seeking a different type of permit to cover these operations. The FAA, TCEQ, and EPA have confirmed the deluge operations may continue in the interim, and operations of the system will not change under this new permit. Again, we really don't have any sort of third-party confirmation of any of this. The TCEQ will not go into detail as to why they've issued these fines or what kind of violations happened and what didn't, because they are in the midst of what's called, quote, enforcement procedures, unquote. So unfortunately, we really can't make any determinations as to whether or not Whitaker was being accurate in these statements. All we know is that the FAA is operating under new allegations that SpaceX did violate some sort of environmental requirement, and so that's what's going on with that, and it's very difficult to determine who's really telling the truth about any of that, unfortunately. So what can we gather from all of this? Well, first of all, again, in my opinion, if SpaceX really had a serious case here, if Whitaker was lying to the Congress, and if SpaceX did absolutely nothing wrong, then they should be in the courtroom right now. The lawyers should be having it out over all of this. This should not just be an open letter to Congress to gain political favor. At the same time, though, I am highly suspicious of the timing of all of this. It is very strange that the FAA chose to issue fines on 2 Falcon-related launches back in 2023 at the same time that all of this stuff started coming up in Boca Chica. That almost seems to me like they're implementing some sort of additional penalties against SpaceX because they've been creating such a problem in Boca. But there's one other serious consideration that needs to be brought up. The FAA could theoretically be granted even more oversight than they already have. As I've mentioned before, in January, Congress is going to decide whether or not to extend the exception for personnel who are riding on experimental spacecraft, including civilians. Right now, the FAA has absolutely no oversight over flights like that because these spacecraft are considered to be experimental and the people riding them have signed informed consent documents. But Elon Musk is saying that Boeing needs to be fined because Starliner was considered unsafe for the astronauts on board. Boeing needs to pay fines because of this in the same way that SpaceX is paying fines because of alleged safety violations. If this was indeed the case, that means the FAA needs to be given oversight over people traveling on experimental spacecraft, which they do not currently have. Is this what Elon is advocating? That the FAA be given more oversight and more power to issue fines than they already have? Because right now, if, for example, the Polaris Dawn mission had gone very wrong and everybody on board had been killed during the launch or during the spacewalk, something like that, the FAA would have had utterly no power to enforce any sort of fines or launch any investigation into SpaceX activities. If the FAA gains the ability to fine Boeing for spacecraft like Starliner, the FAA will gain oversight over every private spaceflight mission that SpaceX carries out on Crew Dragon or Starship from here on out. And that is the last thing I think that any of us really want. So Elon, be careful for what you wish for. It might just come true. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon and PayPal because, as some of you probably heard, Crew 9 has been delayed yet again to this weekend, meaning that I have to stay down here in Cape Canaveral even longer. Higher hotel rates, of course, as time goes on. But in any event, if you feel comfortable with supporting this endeavor, all the details are in the description. So until next time, stay angry about space.